This just in, news, headlines, goings-on have occurred. This week, we wanted to talk about systemic racism in the housing market, how white Americans have disproportionately benefited from government handouts, and how the federal government used housing policy to segregate communities. So, if you didn't check your white privilege at the play button, we invite you to do so now. Welcome back to What the Hell Are They Talking About? The show that is to John Oliver what a 5-year-old's finger painting is to a Van Gogh. Since our last episode on the USPS, some news has come out that we would like to share with you. On Tuesday, Louis DeJoy, the Postmaster General and runner-up in the Dean Norris lookalike contest, said he will suspend any policy or operational changes until after the presidential election. This is great news because it serves as a reminder that we the people actually can make a difference. Thanks to the countless journalists who covered this story and the informed citizens who read about it, the Trump administration's efforts to skew the election have, at least for now, been stopped. Or delayed. I don't know. God knows what he's going to get up to next week. Moving on to our real story, affordable housing. More specifically, the affirmatively furthering fair housing provision of the Fair Housing Act, known as the AFFH. This provision has made headlines recently because of a tweet our commander-in-chief wrote, in which he said, "The suburban housewife will be voting for me. They want safety and are thrilled that I ended the long-running program where low-income housing would invade their neighborhood." There's just something a little off-putting about how Trump writes suburban housewife complete with quotes. I guess it's less off-putting than his other favorite way of classifying women, which is to call them nasty, so we'll take what we can get. What exactly is the AFFH and who was it meant to protect? Well, to understand it, we need to go back to the 20th century and talk about our history of redlining in this country. But a bit of a disclaimer before we start. This is by no means a comprehensive history of racial housing policies in the United States, but rather a concise overview that hits on the most important points. Technically speaking, racially motivated housing policies began with the passing of the Homestead Act in 1862 that provided any adult or citizen with 160 acres of government land to live on. Obviously, since this was passed in the 1860s, any adult or citizen really meant white adults. Historian Carrie Lay Merritt researched the effects of the Homestead Act, and the data is astounding. 1.6 million white families became homeowners under the act, while only 5,000 African Americans ever benefited. About the Homestead Act's long-lasting effects, Merritt writes this: "The number of adult descendants of the original Homestead Act recipients living in the year 2000 was estimated to be around 46 million people, about a quarter of the U.S. adult population. If that many white Americans can trace their legacy of wealth and property ownership to a single entitlement program, then the perpetuation of black poverty must also be linked to national policy." This information subverts the typical argument used against people of color in this country, that they are the recipients of too many handouts, being cared for by an overly aggressive nanny state. Rather, with this information, it becomes abundantly clear that white people have benefited astronomically more from government handouts than black. Now, enough about the Homestead Act. It's time to move on to its even more horrifying sequel, redlining. In his essay, The Case for Reparations, author Ta-Nehisi Coates gives an excellent overview of America's racist housing policies that ended up segregating communities. In 1934, Congress passed the Federal Housing Administration, an agency that insured private mortgages. This move caused interest rates to drop, and it lowered the size of down payments required to purchase a house. The FHA created maps of neighborhoods and colored them based on their perceived stability. A white neighborhood would often be given an A rating and colored in green. These places were considered great prospects for insurance. Neighborhoods where African Americans or immigrants lived were typically given a rating of D and were usually considered ineligible for federally insured mortgages. On FHA maps, these neighborhoods were colored red, hence the term redlining. In the FHA's own underwriting manual, they wrote, "Incompatible racial groups should not be permitted to live in the same communities," which sounds less like something you'd hear from an American and more like something you'd hear from Adolf freaking Hitler. The manual also suggested that a good way to separate neighborhoods would be to use highways as barriers between them, a practice you can see here in our hometown of Kansas City by just looking at Highway 71. This practice of redlining left many people of color who wanted to become homeowners vulnerable to loan sharks and subprime mortgages. Coates tells the story of a resident who bought a house on contract, meaning he would make payments directly to a seller, not the bank, as if he were renting the house. The seller would keep the deed to the house until the contract was paid in full, but unlike a regular mortgage, homeowners would gain no equity while doing so. If a single payment was missed, the down payment would be forfeited, as well as every monthly payment made up until then, and then the tenant would usually be evicted. Wow. Last time I missed a payment on something, I paid a $50 fine, got upset, down to fifth, and fell asleep playing Words with Friends. It's astounding to see the different worlds we live in. This practice of redlining was essentially legalized segregation, and it was going on up until the 1960s, which is crazy to think about. Just think about how recent that is. We are only one Hugh Grant removed from state-sponsored racism. In 1968, Congress passed the Fair Housing Act, which was intended to allow people of color to move into places where they previously could not. But by this point, the damage had already been done. Houses in white neighborhoods were too expensive and required equity, and people of color just couldn't get in. After years of being stuck with subprime mortgages with absurd payment plans, very few black Americans could afford to move to the suburbs the Fair Housing Act was supposed to open up for them. And this is so important because it is a key contributing factor to the racial wealth gap. Homeownership is the primary vehicle for wealth accumulation, and for decades, policies and financial practices robbed people of color their ticket to the middle class. Fast forward to today, back to the AFFH. This rule was put in place by the Obama administration, and in effect, it tells jurisdictions that receive federal housing funds that they have to assess what patterns of housing discrimination they have and then come up with a plan to diminish them. Advocates for the AFFH say it finally gives some specificity to the Fair Housing Act because, as one expert put it, what was on the books simply wasn't working. In practice, the AFFH would have made it so that neighborhoods with histories of segregation would potentially have to rezone and maybe allow apartments to be put up in places where they previously weren't. This rule was just one way for the US government to make up for its long history of racial discrimination, righting a wrong that made so many generations of people easy prey for loan sharks. And granted, this rule doesn't even begin to make up for the harm done to people of color in this country. The AFFH is basically like a husband running out of the house on his forgotten wedding anniversary and quickly picking up the last bunch of flowers at the supermarket. Sure, it's better than nothing, but it's just still not enough. Critics of the AFFH say that it is unlawful overreach by the federal government, but what's funny is you don't hear them saying the same thing about redlining. Redlining was almost certainly unlawful government overreach, and the AFFH is an attempt to rectify that. And what's worse is now Trump is actively trying to do away with this rule, citing old racist tropes. In his tweet about the decision, a phrase that never ceases to make me roll my eyes, he says, "Your housing prices will go up based on the market and crime will go down." And just think for a second about how messed up that is. Trump is basically saying, no, he is saying, I will keep black and brown people out of your neighborhoods and crime will go down. It makes me sick to my stomach to realize that our commander-in-chief, the face of democracy of the free world, is using his office to spout racist lies. Because they are lies. Obviously, the idea that low-income housing creates crime is absurd. This study lays it out very clearly. The findings suggest that low-income housing developments are not uniformly criminogenic, and both development characteristics and neighborhood conditions are relevant for understanding crime in low-income housing developments. So there it is. Honestly, we all should be in support of rules like the AFFH. Our country has so many wrongs to rectify, and it was the goal of the AFFH for local governments to study their past mistakes and make up for them. Redlining and racially charged housing policies are not things of the distant past. They are recent, and their effects are still being felt today. If the federal government can choose to destroy so many people's lives, it has a moral obligation to make up for those mistakes. And we, the people of this country, should hold them accountable for that, should hold ourselves accountable for that. Every citizen should want to see rules like the AFFH in place. If America really is the great country we say it is, the land of opportunity, then this should not even be up for debate. Because housing policy falls under the purview of housing and urban development, there's not a lot we can do here. You can't really write to your senator and ask them to fix this. What we can do, however, is vote for Joe Biden in November, who has stated publicly that he would implement the AFFH in full. So if you care about justice and righting generations of wrongdoing, the choice is really quite clear. That's our show. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.